Our first speaker is Steve Wiggins, who is a senior researcher at ODI. He is not a new speaker at this briefings. We have had him for a couple of times, so it shows how popular he is. So I have a pleasure to welcome Steve.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, Excellencies and colleagues. I have the great pleasure of kicking this off with 10 minutes to talk about an overview of what we know about rural-urban links. And I'm going to divide this into the 10 minutes into a few minutes that deal with some theoretical perspectives, a little bit of empirical insight, and something on policy. Now, let's see. Is it going to work if I click that? Yes. Yeah, it's working. Okay, so look, the theoretical proposition is simply this. If we get urban development and the right kind of urban development and the productive cities that my colleague has just talked about, and we can thicken the links between town and country, potentially we get a whole series of useful benefits. Now, for farmers, those benefits are being closer to an urban market means more opportunities to produce a wider range of produce, more produce, and often produce of higher value than just pure staples. So there's a market opportunity there. If you're closer to towns, your transport costs come down, which means that your effective price for your produce at the farm gate goes up. So in effect, you're getting higher prices simply because the urban areas are of easier access. And the flip side of that is you're getting lower transport costs and easier access to those sorts of things that matter for farmers that are often coming out of urban areas. So those are manufactured inputs like fertilizer, crop protection chemicals, simple tools, irrigation systems, and so on. Maybe some technical advice, marketing advice, and access to banks, microcredit institutions, and others with their financial services. So all other things being equal, one will always expect that with closer links to the city, lower transport costs, you will get both cheaper costs of production, a higher price for your output, and you will get a stimulus to your agricultural development. For rural households, there are further benefits, and that is that as you get closer to towns, or it's easier to access towns, you've got opportunities for alternative forms of earning, and those include jobs, which may be in more remote areas, either on daily commuting or some form of migration, remembering that an awful lot of migration is temporary, circular, or seasonal. It's not a one-off move. And you also get, once you're closer to towns, you get a demand for leisure services at weekends, vacation times, and for some environmental services, all of which give greater opportunities for people to earn more diverse incomes and higher incomes in rural areas. And the combination of those factors of a fillip, a stimulus to agricultural development with new things you can do for rural households, you get a stimulus to the rural non-farm economy. And as we'll see in just a moment, that can be rather useful. Now here's the empirical bit. And the first thing I want to show you is this somewhat remarkable story which is coming out of dryland India. ICRISAT, the big drylands international research centre at Hyderabad. In the mid-1970s, ICRISAT selected 6 dryland villages on the Deccan of India and said, we will track these villages through time. And they tracked them with repeated surveys of those villages. The most recent one for which there are reports is 2011. So let's just have a look at this rather interesting chart of what's changed there. Yeah, it's come out a bit small on the screen I'm looking at, but what you've got there is on the horizontal axis, you've got time running from the 1970s up to the current time. And what we're looking at that is rural daily wages in real terms, yeah? Rural daily wages. Incomes looks pretty much the same, but I've taken rural daily wages there because they're a good indicator of what happens to the poor. Now, what you can see there, or what you could see if it was a little bit bigger, or a lot bigger, is that those wages, they're around about 50 rupees a day at the start of the period, and all the way through to about 2000, they're moving upwards. And they're moving upwards because there is progress in these villages. There's more irrigation, there's more high-value crops, and those villages are genuinely progressing. Given what most people thought about the fate of the Deccan in the early 1970s, what had been achieved by 2000 was pretty good going. No doubt about that. But the big thing to note on that chart there is there's a takeoff. And there's a takeoff in the first half of the 2000s. And those wages which have been creeping up just start to go woomph, yeah? And those wages that had started out in a range of round about 50 rupees a day, by the time you get to the current thing, they're in a range, in the worst village about 125, they've more than doubled, and in the most prosperous they're 5 times larger, they're 250 rupees a day. These are in constant real terms. What has made that big difference? The answer is more rural-urban links. It's been a huge thickening up of the rural non-farm economy, and with that, a big tightening on the rural labour markets. And when rural labour markets tighten, people's prospects and people on low incomes prospects improve enormously. And this is something we've been seeing across Asia in the last 15 years. And it is something that could be seen across Africa in the coming decades. Now, you might say, well, that's Asia, and Asia is special. These are some results looking at farm incomes, or the equivalent of farm incomes, in Kagera, Tanzania. What you're looking at there is farm incomes at the start of a set of panel studies, 1991, 1994, and again, a certain number of households in Kagera, Tanzania, it's the northwest part of Tanzania, have been tracked through time, and most recently round about 2010. Now, you've got 7 columns there. So those columns are distinguished by whether people remained on the farm, whether they went to medium cities, whether they went to large cities, whether they went back from cities to farms, and so on, yeah? And the total is over on the right. Now, if we look at what those incomes are, and again, these are in constant terms, that's what it looks like most recently. Those incomes have gone up quite a lot since the early 1990s. There are 2 things I want you to note from this. That is, one, that the incomes have gone up, but some of the biggest increases in these incomes are households that have had more to do, closer interaction with the cities. That study has been interpreted by some people to say the sooner you get out of the village, the better, which is sort of true. But it's also true that those people who remained on their farms also got richer. But what it does demonstrate is that Kagera has progressed as it's got closer interactions with the cities of Tanzania. Okay, last slide. Let's have a look at some things on policy. And there are basically 3 things to be said about policy to improve rural-urban links. The first thing to say is that a lot of what has to be done by governments doesn't need to be particularly sophisticated. It doesn't need to be much different to what governments are already committed to. It's just a question of following through and doing the right kinds of things. Now, specifically for rural-urban links, it's obviously building roads and maintaining them. Not very romantic, not necessarily exciting, but roads are game changers. I was reading a blog last night where somebody had gone back to a Tanzanian village they'd a Tanzanian village way down in Ruvuma area, a remote part of Tanzania, that they'd studied about 20 years earlier. And the big thing this person reported on their blog was, when I went to Ruvuma in the early 1990s, it was 6 hours of painful driving from the main city. Yeah? And you were lucky if you got there some days. The road, you know, things could break down or the road would be pure impassable. And the guy said, I couldn't believe it. I was there in an hour and a half on a perfectly good, it was a gravel road but well maintained. So roads matter. So does health, so does education, investing in agricultural research and so on. So a lot of what we need is stuff that is being done at the moment. Just keep on doing it. By the way, I'm doing a lot of studies at the moment looking at Asia, and the big story in Asia is carry on doing the right things for 30 years and you will see magnificent changes. Now, people have talked quite rightly about secondary towns. The growth of secondary towns is extremely interesting. We do have some information that says that secondary towns tend to generate more jobs which are accessible to people with relatively low skills and lack of experience than the jobs that you find in the metropoles. Yeah? Do we have a policy to foster secondary towns? Oof. We've had lots of theories, we've had growth poles, we've had agripolitan centres and so on. We don't necessarily have any proven ways to do it. But there is a proven way to make sure that secondary towns don't grow, and that's to take the entire infrastructure budget and spend it in the capital city on big showpiece projects, yeah? So don't do that, make sure that secondary towns get their share of physical infrastructure budgets. And the third thing in the policy box is, and I apologise, I should have written these out. There's been a lot of interest in local economic development, LED, rural territorial development, which Michael has mentioned, the Latin American experience of desarrollo rural territorial, DTR, and there's been a lot of interesting writing about creating industrial clusters. Now, a lot of that interesting literature on things that you may be able to do at the local level to stimulate more enterprise, there are very few generalizable lessons coming out of this, yeah? It's very much case by case. If you do these things with decentralization, they can work. They're probably not going to be big drivers of change. For that, you want the nuts and bolts, the making sure the infrastructure, making sure your macroeconomy works, you've got the right kind of investment climate. But as an add-on, some places have been able to get additional impetus to their economies through things like territorial development, industrial clusters, and so on. And if you can do that, these are a useful add-on. So there you have it, a three-part introduction.
Thank you very much, Steve, for very precise, very focused presentation and for keeping to time. So this was really excellent.